Hello. I'd just like to throw a thanks to Maddox, JD, Philip, and everyone else for all the hard work on bringing MacDevOps online. And for Matt, you requested more fire, so there's your more fire. So my name is Gordon Niemann. I'm a DevOps engineer with Electronic Arts. And for a living, I provide macOS deployment automation for most of EA's mobile teams worldwide. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And also how I became more than just a cog in sort of the big machine that is EA. So how this is going to flow, I'm just going to give you a really quick history of myself. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about EA and my department, and then I'm going to talk about what DevOps is like at EA, past and present, what our deployment flow looks like, what has been working and what hasn't been working, and then a few future things that I really want to work on and get some feedback from you guys. And I'll wrap it up by saying, you know, how I became, I think I became more than just a cog at Electronic Arts. So I actually started my career in IT and DevOps as a Microsoft admin, a Microsoft certified systems engineer, or at least until Microsoft got sued in Quebec court. And then I was a Microsoft certified systems expert. This little thing called the .bomb happened, to date myself, I guess, a little bit. After that, I was a Cisco guy for a bit. Then I was a Sun Solaris guy for a bit. And then I wound up into the security industry, designing access control and CCTV IP camera systems for like embassies and high-rise buildings and things like that. So I did that for 10 years. And one day when I came into the office, my boss at the time had passed away. So shorter after that, I was the company president. Not the way I wanted to be promoted. Within about a year, the company sold, and I was back to designing security systems for me. So 2 years of that went by. I think actually 2 years to the day, and I was getting pretty bored. I've done that for too long. So I did one of those sort of like snap midlife crisis things, and I went back to school. It's always fun when you're like the oldest student in the class by over 20 years, but it served its purpose. A few contracts later, I was at Electronic Arts, actually starting in a contractor position. One thing that became really apparent, I mean, in the security industry, I mean, there were mid-sized companies with maybe hundreds of people, being Electronic Arts with thousands of people, you know, and even more so worldwide. It was really easy, you know, if you keep your head down at a company like that, it's really easy to sort of just get lost. People come and go quite often. So, you know, if you don't sort of distinguish yourself, it's just, you just sort of disappear into the noise. And sort of on top of that, coming in, especially when I joined EA about, well, just under 3 years ago now, it was, you know, EA had a bit of a reputation, but also just the magnitude of the size. So EA has 35 locations worldwide. So, you know, now going from only dealing with people here on a local level to now working with teams worldwide. Worldwide, EA Electronic Arts has around 10,000 people, and that's not counting contractors. Here in Burnaby, in Vancouver, where the conference takes place, normally for MacDevOps, the campus has about 2,000 staff on site, and again, not including contractors. When I first started, I was told it would take like about 3 months sort of to get on board and get used to being at EA. I couldn't find my car after 3 months. I mean, the parking lot was so gigantic. Never mind finding my way around, you know, EA's massive software stack, and a lot of it being custom. On top of that, EA also kind of had a little bit of a bad rap as a corporation. And my dark corporate overtones aside, and despite what you might have read on Reddit, EA is actually a pretty good company to work for. You know, the executive team really seems to focus on inclusion and staff well-being. And then depending on your location, there's actually quite a few perks. This is a picture here of the Burnaby campus here in Vancouver. So some of the perks include that we have our own beach volleyball court right beside our own soccer field. right beside our own basketball court. Of course, we don't get to enjoy that right now because we're all working from home, but that's not going to last forever. They also let you take your dogs to work. This is the stares I would get from a few cubicles over every time I opened anything that remotely looked like food for like a good year. Yeah, so it's actually a pretty good place to work for in that respect. If that sounds good to you, I've actually included a link to our career site at the end of my presentation. Like the abbreviated name, EA's got a lot of acronyms. Feels like it was like half the onboarding. I work for a team called DRE, and that's Deployment Release Engineering, Infrastructure Engineering. DRE inside Electronic Arts is like a mid-sized team. We have about 120 engineers, and IE is a smaller group comprised of about right now 9 people, and we have some members here on the West Coast, some members out on the East Coast, and then over in Europe. And then fingers crossed, maybe coming up in the Asia Pacific region. In a nutshell, DRE is sort of the frontline build automation for a lot of the game teams, whether it be console or mobile, or whereas IE is a smaller crack team inside DRE that just handles infrastructure automation. So, creating the base systems that frontline is going to use to invoke Jenkins and so forth to build games. Specifically on the mobile side, we've seen pretty extreme growth. So EA obviously already had studios all over the world, but DRE was looking at some of those EA studios like customers, and as such, we were bringing them on. So in 2016, we were working with studios here in Vancouver, or game teams here in Vancouver, Orlando, and Romania. By 2017, we've expanded to Seattle and Melbourne. 2018, we're in Charlottetown, Austin, Texas, Sacramento, and Shanghai. And then just recently adding game teams in Pasadena and Redwood Shores. So our mobile part of DRE has seen some pretty rapid growth as far as us providing automation for these different teams. So one of the things that sort of came apparent when I started Electronic Arts is that Macs didn't get a whole lot of love. EA really is a Microsoft shop with a sprinkling of Linux. And that's really because the games we make run on consoles and PC. And the tools for those things are generally Windows-based or Linux-based. There's not a whole lot of development happening on the Mac side, except for mobile. So mobile being one of the few exceptions. So day one, what did Mac automation? So I came to DRE, sat down, and had to do deployments. What did it look like on day one? Didn't. If I needed a new Mac VM, that was manual 4 to 6 hours of tools and configuration for the few projects we had at the time. Need a physical Mac? make a ticket to IT. Wait a week, and then another 4 to 6 hours of manual configuration and tools. And so it was kind of good, actually, the time that there was only a few projects, because today we're providing automation on the mobile side for 20 plus projects. So doing all of that manually would have just been basically impossible. In fact, I can even remember inside the first week, a more senior engineer taking me inside and saying that the only reason I was here is because no one wanted to deal with the Apple side of the equation. On the hardware side, there was also a lot of inconsistencies. So if a Mac was being hosted on a virtual machine, it was professionally installed in a data center. So it had UPS backup. It was connected with a fiber network to a big data store. It had a backup generator. It was rack mounted. It looked professional. If it was a physical build machine, then it was out on the studio floor somewhere, and like a leaning Pisa of Mac Minis connected to like a hand-me-down 10-year-old switch, and like connected to maybe an overloaded power bar. So there was this huge difference. And not only that, there was no control over where builds would happen. So it very often could be the case where like some test build could be happening inside the data center, and then like a release production build was happening on this precarious combination of Mac systems. So the software side wasn't fun either. One of the pieces of software that constantly got in the way of builds actually was Jamp. It was IT controlled, so DRE couldn't control that piece. So we discover something that Jamp was breaking, we send a ticket to IT, and then usually we get kind of a response from IT like this. So actually in the beginning, Jamp kind of had a bad name in DRE, mostly because of the lack of knowledge around it. As an example, if a new build system was created, you needed a ticket being basically created. Yeah, so if a new virtual machine, or sorry, a new Mac system had been provisioned onto the network, a ticket had to be sent over to the Jamf team. Otherwise, SSH and VNC would be turned off every 30 minutes. So if an engineer went in, turned on SSH, it was gone in 30 minutes. So I end up getting a lot of tickets claiming of possessed Macs. So you'd end up sort of with some funny situations just around some of the lack of knowledge around how Mac setups were supposed to work. It was pretty apparent that from the outset I needed to accomplish quite a few goals in a short period of time. We needed automation. We needed that automation to be secure, and we needed some security automation. So as an example, typing in a 15+ character password into a VMware console was not fun. Especially if you had 10 machines that were being requested or something like that. We needed trust. So a lot of the departments were very siloed. So DRE, i.e. needed the ability to do things themselves. We didn't want to be able to create tickets, wait for other teams to respond. We need to be able to be given the latitude to do those things and create those bridges. We definitely needed standardization. As I was mentioning earlier, there was this huge gap between the quality of how build systems were deployed. And then we needed testing. So, Mac updates aren't always the greatest quality. Sometimes, even past that, sometimes things like Xcode updates would break the games. And we didn't want midnight requests to change things. So being able to test, if the next Python version was going to break this, or if the next Xcode version was going to break that, we could go to the game teams then afterwards and be like, hey, fix this before it becomes a requirement. So there were a few barriers to getting this all going. Coming into DRE already had a lot of in-flight systems that were pretty complicated. So DRE was handling thousands of Windows VMs here in Vancouver, hundreds of Linux VMs, over petabyte range deployments. So there's huge infrastructure handling what was going on. And not a whole lot of that was built with Mac infrastructure in mind. It was more of an afterthought in that particular respect. We had tools. EA had tools like Jamp, but DRE wasn't allowed to use them because they were siloed in the Jamp team inside of IT. So the best we could do with Jamp was, put in requests via tickets, to add things, change things, and that's improved now. But in the beginning, it was more of a hassle. The same was also for modern MDM type solutions. Again, we weren't able to have direct access to it, so it couldn't be really part of our automation flow, at least not from an agile perspective. We were making pretty heavy use of Chef too. That would have worked great. The only issue is because we had so much set up around it that we were using older versions of Chef. So just recently we migrated away from Chef 12 as an example, and the older versions of Chef had a lot of compatibility issues with Mojave and Catalina. So they could easily break things. And then the final barrier was that every project was like night and day differently. One team could be using Unity, another could be using Unreal, another could be using a custom engine. I think across all the projects we were working with almost 5 different engines. And then on top of that, a lot of those engines and those development workflows had pretty complex environment requirements, non-standard setups, and then lastly, we also had to do archiving. So when a game gets put to pasture, we have to be able to bring it up again one day. That means recreating its entire environment. So we had to have something that we could come back to in the future if we had to resurrect an old title. A good example, not on the mobile space, but Command & Conquer CNC just came back. if we didn't have all the archiving in place to have access to those game assets and those the code base, then projects like that may not have happened. So for our deployment automation workflow, we use a combination of Chef for our baseline for all the systems, so all the commonalities. And then we used post shell scripts to do sort of the post customization for the different projects. And that shell script would use a lot of different things. Like as an example from the previous talk, it was mentioned that PyEnv was an interesting tool to control Python, and that's an example of something that the post shell scripts would invoke in order to install particular Python versions and things like that. On top of that, some of the game teams also had GUI land automation requirements. Like for instance, Unity, Unreal, the engine lives in the GUI. So we found that Chef wasn't like super great at invoking GUI land type automation. And lastly, Chef, complexity, because of all the hierarchy required for all the Windows, Linux deployments, overwhelmed some of the startups that we were bringing on board. They didn't want to deal with it. So that's kind of why we focused on the sort of the hybrid solution. So how that looked was when a new system needed to get, or systems needed to get built or provisioned, we actually just started with a shell command, and basically just including like a security token and then the system arrays. So the script would go reach out and then talk to GitLabs, and it would pull down the JSON configuration. So the JSON configuration had like a one-stop shop for the entire configuration of a system outside of the baseline. On the Chef side, you kind of had to dig through a few cookbooks and recipes to figure out what was being installed where. But for the post customization for the projects, the one single JSON file basically was the one-stop shop for the entire configuration of product. On top of that, because it was source controlled, any one of the teams could go in and change it. Oh, for all future projects, I want Xcode this, and it would go ahead, and that would be now the standard for new systems. After that, after the script pulled the JSON configuration, it would actually reach out to Vault using the token that was provided on the startup, and Vault would basically hold all of our secrets. So you never had to worry about entering secrets anymore into shell and then having to worry about history-c or something like that. Everything was controlled inside of Vault. After all that information, it would reach out to Chef, and then Chef would do the baseline on the system. And Chef would utilize a whole bunch of different things. We had Artifactory, and those are synced into different servers worldwide. So it could get the binaries, cache binaries, without, say, Shanghai having to, say, speak to Vancouver. Chef also did a bunch of other things around inventory automatically and Zabbix for monitoring the different build systems. And when the Chef process was complete, a PostScript was then uploaded to the system, and then the final configuration took place. So that PostScript was downloaded from GitLabs, and that script also utilized things like Artifactory in order to deploy all the different binaries and requires environment variables configurations to the system. A year ago, I was considering using Monkey for some of these things, but I got scared off by the talk about it may being deprecated because of the impending doom of Python. But for now, I mean, Monkey might still be an option. I'm definitely going to take a look at Monkey reports coming up here. But for now, this has been our development flow that's been pretty stable. Here's an example of what the command might look like. So deploy Mac build machine, the project. So in this case, FIFA Mobile. I give it that ephemeral token that's going to be used by Chef. And then I can give it an array of host names, an array of IP addresses. So the only thing that has, that's really obvious outside of the project, the token, is the IP addresses. If IP addresses weren't provided, then it would just automatically build the host names depending on the project. But the basically by giving an array of the different systems, you could just press enter and walk away, and then in however time it took, those systems then would be completely created without completely hands off. So on the hardware side, we started making pretty heavy use of Rayton KVMs. These are IP-based KVMs. And what they basically allowed us to do, and this is even before this COVID situation, basically allowed us to access Mac systems through anything web enabled. So no Java required, anything like that. It's completely HTML5. So this also lets us get into the recovery console remotely. So that's been a huge plus if you have to do, if the Nuka system or something like that. And it also supports things like copy paste. You can connect drives remotely, things like that. So it's really given us a lot of ability to control our systems without having to be in the office. The only unfortunate part of the Rayton KVM solution is the cost. I think for about eight systems, or an eight port version, you're probably somewhere in the ballpark of $4,000 to $5,000. On the testing side, we actually ended up using VMware Fusion. So it looks like something like this. We would have, if we had, like, say, a test a new version of Xcode, what we basically do is we kick off a script. It would use the limited shell command structure inside of VMware Fusion to stand up a VM that of the proper environment, configure it, and then run the test we wanted. Right now, it's sort of like on a project by project cadence, but in the future, we hope to move that to more global outlook. We make pretty heavy use of Mac virtualization. So the setup looks something like this. We have a whole bunch of the 2013 trash cans inside Sonnet cases. And they are, of course, using Intel fiber cards to connect to a NetApp storage arrays. Now on the Windows side and the Linux side, using Dell servers, this works really well. On the Mac side, it's more challenge. I mean, it is slow. So, Mac performance per the VM, maybe something in the realm of 40% of what the Mac, 30 to 40% of what the actual, bare metal trash can could do. But it is stable for some projects, and it does give us a level of agility that maybe like a cloud solution would. However, for some projects, especially projects that have engines that live in the GUI, like Unity, it's been actually a kind of a showstopper. So we've gone through the point where we've set up some solutions for customers only to have, like, say, 6 months later, when an Apple update came, or an ESXi, which is the VMware operating system update came, we could end up with a situation where the entire project would basically crash. And diagnosing it was a nightmare, because who do you talk to? Apple, VMware. It wasn't a great situation. So we're actually looking at migrating away from that to something, either a cloud solution or maybe Verta2 or something of that nature. Some of the other fun things we're working on. We're building our own mobile farms for testing. So it's not just good enough that DRE provide a build. Jenkins says it build, great. No, we have to make sure the actual game can play. So we have created some automated testing where the game boots up after it's being built, gets thrown to a cell phone, and then it does something basic, like, it like goes through the menu and jumps in the game, kicks a ball, and then that sort of thing. So we've been doing this as sort of like a double check for a lot of our customers to make sure that before we pass it on to QA, or maybe an engineer in the game team wants to test it, that they have something that's actually going to work. And that's something that we've actually been building up. Anyone else has done something like this, definitely want to hear from you. Other interesting projects we have coming up is we're going to be building a 64 Mac Mini cluster inside a single rack. What we're seeing here is actually one from 2012, a 160 Mac Mini installation. So I'm not doing something quite that big. But if anyone else has some interesting things to say about, mass deployments of mini systems inside a data center, a type environment, I'd love to hear from you after the presentation as well. On the Windows side, we have set up a self-service portal in Jenkins. So an engineer in DRE who's authorized can go into a Jenkins portal and request a Windows VM. They just specify how much cores they want, what project's going to be, and boom, it goes and creates it automatically for them and then sends them an email when it's done. I want to do something like that for Mac, and I've been working towards that. A little bit more complicated because of the physical systems, but something where, you know, a user can say, oh, here, this IP address, I want it to be this project, and it goes out and checks that system, and then, you know, it may clean it, revert it back to default state, install the project, and then connect it to their Jenkins master for their project, add the labels, and start building. So I'm moving towards, or we're moving towards self-service for our Mac automation, maybe something for a talk at next year's DevOps. Another thing I really like to try is Virtu, which is a Mac containerization product. And I'd like to try to mesh that with Terraform. We use Terraform on the Windows and the Linux side to do some mass deployments for a few projects. And I'd like to see what we can do on the Mac side for that. Again, if anybody who is listening has done either anything with Virtu or maybe a combination with Terraform, I'd also like to really hear from you offline. On the testing side, I'd mentioned that we use Fusion, but it's kind of like a one-off per project. Right now, we're going ahead and we're installing profiling jobs in all the Jenkins masters for all the projects, so that we have a script that will go out and automatically talk to those Jenkins masters, create. So if I say I want to test Xcode, you know, whatever, instead of me doing it on project by project, I can just say test Xcode, and it will go, and it will in serial go through all the projects and test them all. So create a Fusion VM, do the configuration, test it, does it build? I get a check mark, and it goes through the list and serial down through all the projects. So maybe on a weekend you can run that, and then, you know, on the Monday I have a report of all the different pieces, all the build solutions. So that's another thing we're trying to go from, you know, minor test automation to like sort of a universal global type testing for all the different projects. So back to why I think I became more than a cog at Electronic Arts. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really easy to get lost in the mix at EA. So I think probably the thing that got me converted to a full-time employee at Electronic Arts, I think the biggest thing was networking. So going out of my way and say sitting in with the game teams meetings with Frontline, not a requirement for an IE member, because we're supposed to be more in the back end, but I really wanted to understand what would make, you know, the projects run smoother. What were they looking for? Going in sort of with the idea that if I could free up another engineer's time by automating something for them, that they could, you know, focus on making good games. Sometimes that meant getting up in the morning to do a meeting in Romania and then ending the day another meeting in Shanghai. But I think it really helped me move forward with creating solutions that people wanted. I mean, you can automate a lot of things, but if you automate something that nobody wants, it's not going to help anyone, right? So by inserting myself, trying to be the bridge between departments. And that was actually another big one, was trying to create that trust. So going out of my way to talk to people in IT, creating business cases to try to get more Mac infrastructure, you know, and maybe in some ways sticking my neck out a little bit with those things, because, you know, pushing those requests to managers and executives. But I think it turned the tide for me, allowing to stay with Electronic Arts and move Mac DevOps forward for them. Yeah, so thank you very much. And we're going to move into Q&A on Discord. And just if I mentioned that there were some links, this particular link here will take you to all the different my contact information if you have any questions outside the conference, as well as some of the things we spoke about, and the EA career site. Thank you.